go to the adoption of the agenda. Anything to add? It's just budget presentation and overview. All right, get a motion on this? Nobody on, Councillor Dunn there, he's had his finger up.
Yeah, because I wasn't sure what to say. So I'll move that we accept the budget as presented.
Not the budget, the agenda.
The agenda as presented.
All right.
I want the
Yeah,
budget.
we don't want to get to the budget just yet, yeah. Yeah. All right, all in favor? Carried. And moving on to the budget presentation and overview. I mean, we're not gonna make a motion at this point. We'll go through the agenda items and we'll go, this will be more, unless we want to make a motion to receive for information at this point. Yeah, I mean, it's not, and we can make a motion, follow our usual protocol of making a motion and then discussing it. So, who would like to make that motion? Anybody? No? James will make the motion. All in favor? Carried. All right, and with that, I'll turn it over to, I think, our CAO.
I'll start it off. Before we get to the presentation, the process that the administration is going to be using for the budget is you'll have a budget binder. All relevant materials related to budget deliberations will be in separate tabs. So at the next meeting, there'll be a new package with the agenda on that tab. Generally, for the next meeting, we'll talk about this meeting. So right now in your binder, there's 4 tabs that have been populated. First tab is the presentation that we will be doing tonight. The second tab is the normal budgetary document that you see. And then the tabs after that are the specifics that the Joint Recreation Committee has seen with the recreation budget and the fire budget in the next tab. And I might have got the tabs out of sequence there, but that's basically what's in all the tabs. So as we go through the presentation tonight, it's the chair's call. I can take questions as we go. If they're very detailed questions, you will not necessarily get an answer tonight, but we'll log those. And then we will start the next budget committee with answers to the outstanding questions. And that's generally, the protocol that I think works best. So we're not jumping back and forth. All the tabs, the page numbers are at the bottom in the PDF copy. So those would be your reference points. If you're referring to a specific page and you have questions, please just note the tab number, page number, then we can all be on the same page, so to speak. So with that, I'll just start the presentation, and there's some things that I'll be ad-libbing that aren't on the slides, of course. So this is the high-level agenda. And again, we're not jumping into the devil in the detail yet. And, we're going to provide some highlights of the pressures that are in the budget, not necessarily getting down to the line details. So these are the drivers that we're going to present tonight in the budget. But besides the drivers, there's a bunch of external stuff that's happening. I find councils are generally interested in how we compare to like municipalities. And there's never such thing as a like municipality, because every council has different services, different envelopes, different kilometers of roads. Some municipalities, some of our comparators do not have indoor recreation facilities such as a pool. So there's different models out there, but I find that looking at it broad-based, your ratepayers and the public in general always are under the perception that taxes are outrageously high compared to other communities. Well, we're going to sort of go through that tonight to see if there's validity in that broad-based statement or not. So we're going to talk about, again, fiscal comparators, some fundamentals about the budget is an annual process, but financial planning for the municipality is a multi-year process. So I want to talk specifically about, look at this budget in the context of the multi-year strategy. So where does council want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and what is, start building that financial strategy to get there. Provincial, federal pressures and other economic pressures, they're all out there, and we'll talk about that a bit. We'll talk about specifically the details of the pressures and drivers in the 223 operating budget. We'll eventually build that outlook, multi-year outlook, so there will be some slides explaining that council has to adopt in principle a multi-year outlook. That information isn't in your binders yet. And specifically on the capital budget, the details aren't there. So the leadership team on that did meet this week. We're changing the presentation of that material before it gets to council. So rather than showing basically a big wish list, administration will be prioritizing from their perspective what capital expenditures are needed. Council can amend, modify, do anything to the projects there, but again, what is the relative priority ranking of the 20 capital items that are there? So we're going through a process, and we're not quite there yet, to prioritize that. So council will have details specifically on the projects and the implications of not doing a particular item, and potentially items that are conditional on other partners coming into the picture. So trying to outline, portray that overlook and overview for council for decisions can be made in a more informed basis. So in terms of the environmental scam, some of the scan, some people may see it as a scam, but it's a scan. This municipality is like a lot of municipalities where everyone's aging, except the people at the front of the council chamber today. And we still have the dynamics where the youth population in the community really isn't declining. So there's pressures on both ends to provide really a much wider array of services. Still maintain those youth services, things people need in the community, but there is an aging population. Public expectations in all areas. We want more access, more online services. We want things quicker. We want the pool open 24 hours a day. We want. Again, that's an ongoing pressure. Environmental regulations in all areas, but specifically water, wastewater, and planning issues. Over the last 15 years, the amount of regs and new regs that have come in, the province and the feds are great at creating regs. They're not so great in providing financial resources to manage the new mandates. So that's a real pressure point, especially for the smaller communities that don't have the capacities as some of the larger ones. Public, greater awareness, not only the public, council members have varying degrees of interest in conservation, recycling, health and well-being. These are all topics of the day. So at the end of the day, councils are always challenged what they want to provide and at what level to the ratepayers. Do you think this is a core municipal service or not? And that's really what the budget is trying to delineate, what services you want to provide and at what level. In terms of the broad economic outlook, it's positive, more positive than it was 2 years ago. So hopefully the worst of COVID and other environmental health issues are gone, or at least that we can be managed better than the pressures in the past. Most of the sectors in Alberta are starting to show positive signs of a recovery. So there's good news there. In terms of the assessment growth rate, it is positive, but modestly positive. It's always good to have a positive assessment growth than some communities that are experiencing significant negative assessment growth. Again, hate to say it, but regardless of what provincial government's been in power for the last number of years, there's downloading and uncertainty relating to fiscal sustainability of their programs. If you're going to AM or RMA, it's always top of mind for those associations to deal with. When are we going to find out from the provincial government sustainable funding, and how's that working? I'll get into it later, but why are we still collecting school taxes on the property tax base? There's those long outstanding issues that aren't going to go away. Good thing, bad thing. Interest rates are going up, which means our investment earnings are returning to pre-COVID levels, so we will be getting additional interest earnings. Bad news is, if we're going to borrow, it's going to cost more to borrow. Inflation is well in excess of normal levels. In addition to that, there's all kinds of supply chain issues that are driving up prices outside of general inflationary. So, there's going to be, when you see the capital budget, some vehicles that we want to purchase. Well, they're all at a premium. It's got to the point now where buying used versus new, that cost differential is narrowing significantly. So anyways, we'll get into it later. But at the end of the day, these are the main drivers in the budget. And when you look at them, they're really non-controllable costs. Fuel, electricity, insurance, road materials, chemicals. These are basic core things the municipality has to buy to provide the core services for the municipality. So the bad news is, really council administration, we can look at ways to, gather further efficiencies, but there's significant external factors that are not controllable by council or administration relating to these issues. I'll make the broad statement now that regardless of what you've heard in the past, when you look at the data from comparable sized municipalities, our tax rates are competitive. They're not at the bottom end, they're not at the top end. The tax burden, I don't like talking about tax rates, I like talking about tax burden, is comparative to similar communities offering the breadth and depth of services. Municipalities, again, a lot of focus on investment attraction and retention, specifically retention. It's a vicious circle. When you talk about economic development, do you do it as a regional zone, or is everyone after the same, is everyone rating everyone else's opportunities? And again, hate to say it, but we'll still have a number of years, in my opinion, of negative provincial downloading. And that will be, reductions in MSI, reductions in sustainable funding, and the like. So we'll get into the details a bit later. In terms of the financial comparators and conditions of municipalities, these are broad-based statements that I'm making. So tax rates is, just a beginning. You have to look at a lot of avenues and a lot of, key indicators of fiscal health and financial health of the municipality. We have reserves, and there's different types of reserves for different purposes. Stabilization reserves, replacement reserves, capital infrastructure replacement reserves. We'll be talking about those strategies later on. But again, my experience is, especially for the business community and for the ratepayers, if we can tell them that with some degree the exposure they have and they know it's coming, people can manage. People don't like spikes in their tax rate. Some councils say, well, we're not going to have a tax increase for 3 years and then hit with a huge tax increase. That's not good for anyone. Sustainability planning, allow people to know what's coming is an important thing. Just on that, and I haven't got it in the numbers there, but if you say the typical assessment in town is around $200,000 in residential, a 1% tax increase is around $20. So just keep that in your head. When we get to the real numbers, I'm not going to really stress the percentages because in reality, 1% is $20. So that's the way I like dealing with it. And I know for some ratepayers, a $20 increase a year may be stretching it. But for the typical household, for the services they're getting, the good news is we're putting in, our Northern Fiber is putting in high-speed internet. Well, that cost is significantly more than the tax burden related to the typical things municipalities have to budget for. Again, our debt levels are manageable and very reasonable, and maintenance of service standards has been predicated in this budget document. Moving on, and we're not there yet, but eventually, you know, we do have a 3-year plan and a 5-year plan, and it's really great on the expenditure side, but we haven't really got a financial strategy attached to those expenditures yet. So that's all this slide's gonna say is, you know, we need to reposition the various studies, master plans that have been done out there and come back with a more full long-term capital investment strategy and the financing strategy associated with it. So, you know, getting back to the capital program, last week or early this week also, the leadership team sat down and had a serious discussion about whose priorities were more important. Some of the projects were actually deferred by the leadership team, so we've been doing our exercise to mitigate things that can be deferred, and we'll be presenting a list of projects on a rough priority basis. Bottom line is, if it's on the top third of the list, we're recommending that it probably should be done. If it's on the bottom third of the list, yeah, we don't have the fiscal capacity to do it, unless council says to do it. Those would be the preferable ones to defer. Again, just for information, I'm sure council members are well aware, of all the property taxes we collect, we're not keeping it all. So the total tax bill, the town gets around 80% of it, 18%, 17% goes to the province, and 1.9% goes to the housing authority. It's a slightly different split between residential and non-residential due to the assessment classes that are in each. But roughly 20 cents of everything we're collecting is going to the province. 2.5 cents is going to the housing authority, and the town's managing the balance. Again,
One more.
again, this is a sampling. It's not all the towns in the province. It was the towns that were more in our geographic proximity. So some of the towns in like southern Alberta I didn't include in this, and the like, but it's a good sample. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think there's 18 municipalities in the province, towns, that are in that 2,000 to 3,000 range, and here's a sampling of some of them. High Prairie, that's the tax rate. Sorry, I've used the 221 tax rates. I'm dumping this from a provincial database, and that's the most recent year that's populated. Otherwise, I'd have to go into the individual websites and get the data. But the bottom line is, like our tax rate, there's not major shifts in the tax rate. So this is to show the relative position of each of the municipalities, not necessarily the absolute, 222 tax rate. But it's not going to shift. It hasn't shifted dramatically. The same pressures the town had last year are the same pressures most municipalities had. Most municipalities had a 2 to 5% tax rate increase last year. So the numbers will shift long term, but generally not much over the course of a year. But anyways, those are the rates, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but you see there's an average there at the last column. The average is 9.858, and we're just slightly above that average. But again, a lot of those municipalities do not have the extensive network of recreational facilities that this town has. So, it's just there for general information, but, and some municipalities that may look really low on the residential side, when you get to the next slide, they're not necessarily that low on their business tax. So those councils have made a decision how much tax burden to put on the res class and how much tax burden to put on the commercial class. And there's no right or wrong rationale. The business community would argue that there is, and they shouldn't be taxed more than the residential. But, relatively speaking, that's a decision for council. So you can see we're not the highest tax rate, we're not the lowest tax rate, and we're pretty close to the average of these comparators.
I think Sexsmith throws that way off.
Yeah. And when you go to the next slide, their commercial rate is significantly higher. So, you know, I'm not gonna talk for Sexsmith, but one could make the argument that they're cross-subsidizing residential rates through excessive taxation on the business side. And, you know, that's that decision that council made, and that's fine. But there's, you know, again, we're slightly higher than the average commercial tax rate, but not outrageously higher. You know, the challenge, especially when you're adjacent to a county, is their residential rates are very, 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 very low because they have tons and tons and tons of linear assets. And, you know, there's no way that there can be a fair comparison. The county that I came from, the average residential property was paying $500 a year in municipal taxes, right? And 90%, but 90% of the taxes they were collecting was from linear taxation. So residential taxes were 5% of their total taxes collection. That's not, you know, if you're gonna compare this municipality, you have to compare it to the same parameters of another municipality, i.e. an urban municipality. And again, I'm gonna hopefully repeat this to you, tell me not to repeat it. The value and wealth of the municipality is generally in two things. And I like Stelco Steel's motto, our product is steel, our strength is people. So, you know, municipalities are the same thing. We've got tons of money invested, multi-generational in our assets. You know, do you want to maintain those assets at an appropriate level or not? But that's where the big expenditures are long-term. The day-to-day operating budget, you know, this municipality has managed that fairly well. Greater focus, you'll hear me saying in a minute, needs to be taken on that long-term, you know, asset management challenges the municipality's gonna have. And again, I didn't have time to do it, but here's a breakout of our current assets. And again, this is at historical cost. So historically, council spent $100 million. Engineered structures, that's, you know, water, wastewater, and the roads. We've got land and land improvements. Land improvements are like the playgrounds and the parks and all that infrastructure that's included in there. Buildings, you know, the admin building, the library, the rec facilities, all those building structures, vehicles and heavy equipment and machinery. Like it's a broad base. It's $100 million. You will be seeing what the replacement cost of that is. I would take a guess right now, the replacement cost is probably closer to 350 million, in that range. So again, things that were built 20 years ago aren't being replaced on the same coin. The chief may correct me if I'm wrong on my numbers, got a beautiful new truck. It was 450.
Actually, it was 512.
512. The current replacement cost of that same truck is 625, 650. So the truck's less than, you know, within a year, it's gone up 20% from a replacement cost. And it, you know, there's a lot behind that. It has, you know, supply issues in the auto industry, blah, blah, blah. But I can guarantee you that this historical cost that's used in our financial statements and predicated on the amount of amortization we should have in our budget and as a parameter, it's at the very low end. So the good news is, this is a really good news slide. If you look at the investment council's been making since 1915 to 1921, the asset base has been increasing. That's great news. So there has been reinvestment into the asset base and the like. the not so good news is even with that level of investment, the remaining life of all the assets has been deteriorating. Not significantly, but it is deteriorating. So it's basically saying at the very high level, if you keep going down this road, your asset base is gonna deteriorate, and you know what happens. If things deteriorate that far down the road, especially when you're dealing with roads and other engineered structures, the cost of rehabilitating them will increase exponentially. So that's the challenge of what's that right balance. You know, it's a slight downward trend, doesn't concern me, but I've done this for other municipalities where they're down to like under 30% remaining life. They got no debt, they got no reserves. They're in trouble, and they will be in trouble trying to manage that on a go-forward basis. So, again, we have these fancy terms, restricted surplus, restricted reserves, blah, 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 blah. I take the simple approach. Council can define whatever reserves they want, and it's up to administration to point them in the right direction of what's the appropriate funding strategy for that reserve. So there's no magic to restricted reserves, unrestricted reserves. Council by motion, unless it's a legislative requirement, such as, you know, under the Planning Act that you must maintain the money for this purpose, council can, at its whim, make a motion to take money for any purposes out of any reserve. So I don't get excited about that stuff. But again, there's another number of factors that administration tries to look at, you know, services provided by municipalities. So this slide, once we get further down, there's no right or wrong number for reserve balances. It depends on the state of the municipality's assets, depends on its service expectations, it depends on a lot of issues to say what a right number is for a reserve contribution. So anyways, that's that. Oh, this is way too much. And again, it's always good for the ratepayers to say, why do we have reserves? Well, we don't want to spike your tax rate in any one year. We want to plan long-term, provide some rate stability, manage our financial affairs in that way, you know, have adequate cash flows, provide for both known items and potentially unknown items. So even though we go through all these processes to look at the state of repair of an asset, well, the engine may blow and that's a $200,000 unexpected expenditure. Do we have enough flexibility in our reserves to manage those type of issues? So again, using those same municipalities, there's a couple key financial measures there. Well, what's the aggregate dollars that are in reserves? What's the value of their assets, i.e. equity in TCA? And this is, what that number is if you look at the assets, like ours are 96 million, but they're depreciated. So the non-depreciated value of the assets is 43 million. And then how much do we have in reserves to cover that 43 million? Again, that's at historical cost. But you can see right now we have what I've coined as percent of TCA equity covered, around 22%. We're not in the best shape, we're not in the worst shape. But, you know, that's the issue in terms of the overall reserve strategy. Where does council feel comfortable with that number? So I can say right now, given our next 5-year outlook, that number will not be $9.7 million in 5 years. It will be under $1 million. So that's, you know, the discussion that I want to have through the budget and ongoing processes with council to say, which way does council wish to go? And then debt used, well, if you look down the list, relatively speaking, we got a low debt level compared to others. And these are just a couple indicators. At the end of the day, you really got to look at everything in combination, right? So Sexsmith, for instance, has $20 million in reserves. Well, I phoned their CAO, Rachel, and I says, hey, Rachel, what's up? She says, well, yeah, but we're using 10 million this year to do some water plant upgrades. So, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of stuff that is, this is just raw data. But it hopefully provides council some indication of, relatively speaking, we're not that bad off. But sustainability is always the challenge. Is it sustainable given the backlog of capital expenditures that need to happen in the municipality? This is some of the information that we'll also be pulling forward to have discussions with some of our funding partners to deal with. We have some challenges. Council's doing some things to deal with those challenges, but in the form of a partnership, we're asking other partners to come to the table also. This is sort of a heavy-hitting slide that, if you look at provincial funding, well, in a series of 4 short years, our provincial funding has been cut in half. So we're talking about, $300,000. That's a significant chunk of change for the town. And to lose that, and I haven't done a projection out, but that number will not be increasing in all likelihood, even with the new provincial funding model as MSI is replaced. So, there's constant pressures to deal with. You will see a shocking number in the budget that we put in just to make sure council members are alert and awake to start developing a strategy to start replenishing that loss of funding. The good news is town debt levels are modest, and over the next few years, numerous of the previous ventures will be paid off. I will not be recommending to council that be used to subsidize the tax rate. This is a great opportunity to deal with that long-term infrastructure investment strategy. So you will not be having a recommendation from me when I'm here that, oh, yeah, let's reduce tax rates, because that's purely a council call, but that would not be an administrative recommendation. So this is a good opportunity to deal with some of the funding reductions that have happened from MSI and the like, build some of the reserves up, and provide some greater cash flow flexibility. So that's it on that side. So we'll be talking more about that in the future, but again, there will be opportunities in the 28 and 25 budget deliberations to potentially reallocate those fundings. So not take them out of budget, but reallocate them to some of the areas that may need shoring up, so to speak. This is not all inclusive because it's hard to create the history when you haven't been around. But these are the big ticket items, and there's going to be other ones that are not on this slide that the town's dealt with in the past. So here's the multi-year budget pressures. And it's funny when you look at the list, most of these multi-year budget pressures, again, council cannot control. Provincial policing, downloading of the RCMP cost onto towns, council really didn't have any control over that. That's added over the last number of years, $132,000 to the town's budget. Provincial grants related to property taxes. So the province made a decision they would cut the grants in lieu of tax by 50%. Council really didn't have a say in that. So we lost $17,000 a year there. MSI reduction operating. This one's a bit tricky, but anyways, we lost some operating funding. And it was purely formula based, so that's the way it goes. MSI capital, again, the province presented it this way to show like the major reductions in any particular year, because some years they front-ended it and you got a year and a half of MSI and blah, blah, blah. It's just too confusing. But the net result is over this time period, we've lost $461,000 of MSI capital. And, you know, that's the message. Again, specifically in 212 and 213, specifically in 213, fuel, chemicals, and insurance are major drivers. And they're, you know, we can do energy efficiencies and we can do this and that, but these pressures are real pressures and they're not going away. The investment earnings, so far in the 23 budget, that negative is a good sign, which means we're increasing our interest earnings budget. So we're gaining 50,000. In the last few years, we've lost a lot of interest earnings, but the budget was basically fixed at a very modest amount. So we didn't lose any budgetary room, but on the actuals, we did, there was a decline in interest earnings over the 2021, 22 years, but on a budget basis, there wasn't. We did meet budget in each of those years. So again, when you're dealing with the budget, it eventually relates to a tax rate bylaw, and the tax rate bylaw is predicated on your budget, not on your actuals. So that's, you know, the methodology here, the madness, so to speak. But at the end of the day, you can see over that short period of time, it's been around $800,000 worth of pressures, and there hasn't been tax rate increases anywhere near that. And I don't know, maybe Meta may know, but I believe in 2022 it was 2 or 3% tax rate increase, and I'm not sure what happened in 20 or 21.
It was 1% the year before,
Yeah.
right?
But anyways, council's made the decision not to recoup anywhere near the losses and pressures due to these issues. I'm just going to provide, and this is some of these slides will be slides that we're going to use at the open house for budget purposes, you know, and just an overview of that stuff. But this is old news, and I'm old, so that's old news from an old guy. But FCM and all the municipal associations started around, I would say, well, I remember I wrote a paper 25 years ago for a municipality, and I called it the crumbling fiscal partnership. And it was an issue related to, you know, what the counties were doing to the urban municipalities. And this has been going on for 25 years, and it's been a constant theme for the last 25 years. But when you look at what's behind it, you know, the sticker shock of getting a tax bill once a year is a sticker shock. Well, when you're going to the gas pump every day and paying provincial taxes and federal taxes in your gas, or when you're, you know, when it's coming up your paycheck every week for your contributions to provincial income tax and federal income tax, you quickly forget all those things, right? But when you get a tax bill, it's like, oh, I got this big tax bill. But the reality is, of all the taxes the average person in this room pays, 42% of all your taxes are being paid to the federal government. You know, 50% is going to the provincial government, and municipalities are getting 8% of the total taxes you pay in all forms. So we're only getting around 8% of the total pie. But we have the majority of the infrastructure, right? We got the majority of the roads, majority of the bridges. They're all maintained at the local level. So there's a big inequity of revenue sharing between the levels of government, and that's a challenge, right? So the average municipalities in Canada, they own 60% of all the assets and are required to maintain them. You know, and it's a big challenge for municipalities because we only really have one source, you know, user fees and property taxes. We're not allowed to run deficits. We're not allowed to do a bunch of stuff. So that has resulted in the last 25 years, a lot of municipalities, not all, but some in this council being left with decisions. What can we defer? What can we try to get another year out of? What can we do this? And long-term, that may not be sustainable, right? But overall, council should be proud of itself, and the residents should be quite pleased that the town has held its own, and it's done a pretty good balancing act. So you'll see my slide coming up on the balancing act, that competing demand about how much to put in reserves, how much to do this, how much to put in service levels versus fee increases and other mechanisms. Again, a lot of challenges, offloading of services. The bottom line is, if you're in, especially in northern Alberta, the cost per capita, due to economies of scale and location, it costs more to do business. It costs more to provide services. It's reality, right? Again, smaller tax base, user fees, do cover some of our program cost, user fee strategies, specifically when it comes to, recreational facilities. Councils are generally all over the map. Most urban municipalities have, gone to what I'll call a modified full recost recovery for water, wastewater. And what I mean by modified is, yeah, they're covering operating, but not necessarily covering capital reinvestment. Again, there's different models out there, but that's where we stand. This is my favorite example, and the numbers are stale dated, but they're close enough. Yeah, the provincial government has provided some relief in fuel because of spiking fuel costs, but at the end of the day, this deals with the federal government and the gas tax we get from the federal level. In every liter of gas, there's around 12 cents of federal tax. In a typical year, there's 13 cents of provincial tax, and we get 2 cents. We get 2 cents. That 2.75 I know is wrong, Rita. I didn't update that. So, do you remember what the gas tax is off the top of your head? I think I might have it on this thing.
Are you talking about the carbon tax or the?
No, the federal gas tax grant.
Oh, 150.
Yeah, so if you can strike out that 275 and it's 150 for this municipality.
I can see you use this for the county.
Yes. So anyways, I knew there was a county in there, but I couldn't find it. Should have done a spell check, eh? Anyways, the bottom line is, gas prices.
Can I ask a question just before we go on, because I don't want to get too far? On your last slide, do we have a way, or is there a way of identifying services and the cost between recreational, social, all the different types of services, and what's coming back to the town? Is there a breakdown in any way of that?
We could give you a proxy. It's not gonna be right.
Okay.
So a lot of our programs are not, we don't do our budget and accounting by program. We do it by organizational unit. So it's a challenge. To give you an example, like the way we reallocate insurance, we changed this year because it was done on a different model. But when you look at insurance, certain operations of a municipality have higher risk associated with them. So, allocate the premium based on risk, which is really where you want to go. Do we know our revenue streams attached by it? Yes and no. Again, it's a matter of how you want to reallocate some cost. The recreation programs, do we fully allocate the cost of providing payroll, accounts payable and all those services to the rec budget? No. So we can attempt to do something, but it won't be done for this week, put it that way.
No, but I think it would be beneficial for us to see the cost of the different types of services, and one of the things that I'm thinking of the next MA is one of the things, like, we're allowed to make one request or whatever, that we find a way to hold our provincial government to task in terms of when you guys create a service, we want to see the 5, the 10, the 15-year plan for that, because in 15 years, we don't want it coming back to us as municipalities that's going to create a cost. how is it that a provincial government and a federal government can create programs that eventually are gonna be downloaded onto a municipality that only gets 8% of the cost? And I think there's some lobbying that needs to be done in that, right? So I don't know how we would word that, but that's sort of where I'm heading with all of this.
Yeah, and I've done some work for AM in the past, and other provinces have the protocol with the provincial government that says if the provincial government's gonna introduce any program that impacts municipalities, they have to give 3-year notice. And they don't have to necessarily fund it, but there has to be a notice period of, because people need to plan, right? It's typical of the provincial governments to start off a new program. That's a great program, maybe great social value, recreation value, or whatever, and they provide program support the first year, second year, third year, and then it's slowly phased out. And then the municipality's stuck with the expectation that the residents want that program continued, right? Anyway, so point well taken.
Sorry, Bill, while you're getting water. John, I thought you were going somewhere else with this. Years back, maybe 3 years ago, I took this, it was municipal planning, like the future, and I think it was put on by an example from somewhere in Ontario. And they were using an accounting model for their municipality based on service, so people could see, roads, getting your, snow shoveled, cost this, because there's organizations that tie into one service. So roads cost this, your recreation costs this, the pool, the rink costs this, and I know we do it by program or by department right now. That's how but if I don't know how complicated it is going to be. And there was several examples given, and I'll have to see if I can find the presentation. But it was to that effect of seeing it from that view, so ratepayers as well as council understood what something costs. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, and I'm pretty familiar with those. There's the Ontario Benchmarking Association, and lots of municipalities volunteer, and they do benchmarking, and they do it fairly well in the sense that, I'll give you an example. If you're in North Bay, Ontario, you probably get 3 times the amount of snow as someone in Southern Ontario. So they rationalized the data takes into account the severity of snow events and the like. So it's useful. Looking at the total cost of providing a service in this community versus another community based on the weather conditions, So if you're going to do it and put some energy into it and do it right. So there are, we can attempt to do that. My preferred method of doing this, because it's always a challenge, and I've done it other places, and we can undertake that review this year, is to do what's called reciprocal accounting. So we don't change our accounting system. We just do it off the book, so to speak, and then allocate out. I like doing it for municipalities to have rates and fees, because it really drives the fact what ratio of cost recovery you have. And don't get scared. I'm of the belief that you get the data and then you present the data, and the cost recovery ratio is really a council decision. But give them the good data to say currently we're at 40% or 60% or 2%, and let council, council may want to, some municipalities I've worked with, council said, look at children's programming. We're not charging. Adult programming, we're recovering 100%, right? So that's the philosophy of the councils of, today. But yeah, we'll attempt to get some better intel on that. I want to do it anyway, specifically for the rates and fee review, because there's not going to be a lot of changes in this recommended budget before you related to rates and fees, but that doesn't mean the process is stopping. We will continue to do analysis of our service levels throughout the year and may come back mid-year with, here's where we are. If you want to consider it, we're bringing it to you in May, because if you want to consider it, we got to program this for the 223, 224, 225 fiscal year. So we can't leave it till today in the budget deliberations and get that homework done, you know, to implement January 1st. So anyways, you know what gas prices have done over the last few years. The federal gas tax, it hasn't changed for this municipality significantly for the last 15 years. So from day one to today, it's pretty well been flat. I would say 15 years ago, gas prices were 60 cents a liter, and tax on that was a lot lower than the tax revenues the provincial and federal government are getting today. There's been no,
Corresponding increase.
there's been no kickback. Other jurisdictions, City of Vancouver, for instance, it has a dedicated tax for gasoline, and it's plowed back into the transportation system. You see the same thing in the States, where legally whatever they collect in gas tax has to be spent on the roads. Well, we don't have that. You know, provincial and federal governments don't do their budget that way. But bottom line is municipalities are getting short-sticked again in terms of revenue sharing. Again, no operating deficits to be seen, to speak of at the town, limited reliance on borrowing, reserves are declining, and funding, will be a challenge. Real tax increases. If you take into account inflation, the tax rates today are probably way below what they were 10 years ago. So in real terms, the town has not increased taxes. Right? So, service levels, to a large extent, from what I know, there has been no major service cuts to speak of. There's been some challenges, but no across-the-board service cuts. So I don't know if the chair wishes to take a break.
Yep.
Yep,
Yep.
we're ready for a
Sure
short break.
does.
Yeah, okay, we'll take 10 minutes.